Welcome, and please introduce yourselves, beginning with Aisling.
Sure. Hi, I'm Aisling Dwyer. I'm a partner at Maples & Calder here in Hong Kong. I practice in the area of litigation, insolvency and restructuring. I've been in Hong Kong for 6 years, having spent about 3.5 years in the BVI prior to moving here.
Great.
My name is Claire Fulton. I'm a partner at Moranto Zhang, and I practice in the finance and restructuring team there. I've been in Hong Kong for 10 years. And worked half of that time onshore and the rest of the time at Morant's.
I'm Fiona Chan. I'm a partner at Appleby. I'm in a corporate group specializing in general corporate, banking, finance, insurances, and private clients practice.
I'm Robert Greaves, Chairman of Hamilton Advisors, a strategic communications firm.
I'm Marian Rajic. I'm a partner at Campbell's. I head up the corporate department and we cover funds, corporate and finance. I was in the BVI for 9 years before moving to Hong Kong about a year and a half ago.
Hi, my name's Joanne Collett. I'm a partner at Walkers in the insolvency and dispute resolution team. I've been in Hong Kong for about 5 years and was in the Cayman Islands for 2.5 years before that.
I'm Frances Wu. I've been in the offshore financial industry for about 25 years out of Hong Kong and working out of Asia. I previously was with Appleby for that period of time, retired about 2 months ago. My previous position with them was office managing partner and group chairman.
Hi, I'm Melly Crespi. I'm a partner in the corporate finance team here at Harney's Hong Kong. I've been in Asia for 7 years now, and roughly half of that time with Harney's, prior to which I was with A&A.
Great. Well, welcome all. I have prepared a list of questions. I've also added to the list, and if you have any questions you'd like to ask or add or topics, please let me know. So I'm going to start from the outside of the table and move in, and I'd like to ask Aisling the first question. What are the factors and trends driving the Asian financial services industry today?
Wow, I'm sure there's a lot we can all cover within that. I suppose important things to look at the moment would be maybe the weakening renminbi. Certainly from my perspective on the restructuring and insolvency front, we're looking a lot at non-performing loans coming out of China and the effect of that on the market. Although I'm sure we'll get to this in due course, the One Belt, One Road initiative is a lot of talk in the industry at the moment and how it's going to shape the Asian financial industry going forward. I guess ASEAN and its rise as well, and the amount of trading that can be done within that is also something. And the existence and our growth of Singapore as a financial hub for Southeast Asia is something that, whilst we look to China a lot, particularly in Hong Kong, if we're looking at Asia more generally, we've got to acknowledge the role of Singapore as a hub.
Great. Ellie.
Okay. I guess two main trends really from my perspective in the corporate finance space. One is the loan and bonds defaults that Aisling identified coming out of China and what that's going to mean, given that institutions are strengthening their distressed debt teams at the moment, what opportunities that gives us in the restructuring space. The other one is the rise of the Chinese banks and how different that's made the corporate finance landscape over the last 18 to 24 months with our traditional client bases, and in fact Hong Kong banks included in that, having to look to different ways to deploy their capital to make money.
Frances.
I think more on a macro level. I think over the past 5 years, we've seen a lot of outbound sort of investment by Chinese businesses, both SOEs as well as private organizations, and anticipating that that's going to continue. And I think on a political level, I think you're going to see China rise more on the political stage, particularly given certain of the political events that have been occurring both in the US in terms of ceding, I think, their role on an international stage, as well as I think the current situation in the UK and the EU. So I think because although historically I think China has been going more softly, I think you're going to see them rise more prominently, and therefore Asia as well. And that's going to drive, I guess, the Asian financial services industry from here in terms of a lot of their sort of outbound investments and a lot of their, I guess, the use of their clout on the world stage.
Yeah, to Francis's point, I mean, I think that's right. There's certainly a feeling, isn't there, that the economy is at a sort of a crossroads, as it were, in terms of moving away from what was quite historical sort of export-driven economy to this more sort of domestic consumption, and China inevitably will be a large factor in that, and the growth of the sort of SME businesses and trade, whether that's internationally or intra-regionally, will undoubtedly drive the financial services, and built into that, I think, a large factor that will form the sort of crux of those growth areas being successful is likely to be infrastructure, and that's certainly in the sort of financing space, which I focus on. We're seeing a lot of investment from banks and other sort of investors and financiers in that infrastructure space.
Great.
I think our experience sort of echoes some of my colleagues here in the sense that we're looking at things like the currency controls in China, for example. So where is the financing coming from? We're seeing an increase in the Chinese domestic banks really getting out into the world stage. But the issue, of course, is can they get their money out of China to actually do the deals? We're seeing a lot of domestic investors, so domestic Chinese funds using domestic money, and then the potential for those domestic funds to actually be looking at doing US dollar funds offshore. So funds that are already offshore, but Chinese managers using those funds, which I think is quite interesting. I think Aisling's point's a good one about Singapore. So we do tend to focus a little bit, I suppose, in Hong Kong on China, but Aisling said Singapore for us is an important region as well. So looking at Indonesia, Vietnam, and other places in the region.
Thank you.
Yeah, just echoing on what others have mentioned before. I think one of the biggest factors definitely is China. All Chinese policy has been having a huge impact on Asian financial services. For instance, the Belt and Road policy, obviously a huge impact on outbound investments and all the development infrastructure developments in other Asian countries, as well as the capital control. The capital control, everybody is kind of analyzing the effects and the policy and how it affect the outbound investment again, as well as the impact on other kind of non-related industries, in the sense that there's a delay in the approval from the Chinese authorities, whether or not it's relating to the industry that they have supposedly banned. It's going to huge impact on how everybody is working. And our experience at the moment is that the deal cycles tend to be a lot shorter, because like our banks or companies, SOEs, private companies, they are all getting approvals, going through the approvals, make sure they can get the approval before they go through the actual legal documentation. So our deal cycle tends to be a lot shorter now for that particular reason.
Thank you. And Marianne?
Well, I'd have to echo that. I mean, it is quite a welcome change for me that the deal cycle is significantly shorter. And by the time we do get instructions, all of the approvals are already in place and a clear plan as to what's going to be done. And I think that's very positive for us and for the onshore council as well. A couple of other observations which might be perhaps sign of the times, but some of the stuff that I am seeing is a lot of move back from the US of sort of repatriation of VC managers and VC experience into China for the purposes of bringing in inbound investment into China and developing the venture capital product in China. And I think there's a huge demand for that. I think everybody's looking for the next Alibaba, and I think there's a lot of funding and quite a lot of excitement about that. There's a lot of money that is being put into that. The other thing is, which is, again, the sign of times, is that China is actually focusing on the green energy now. And there's a lot of outbound investment into green energy projects and listings of green energy projects on the US markets. which seems to be the complete opposite of the intention of the US elections. But it seems to be it seems to be something that's I think the Chinese are really good at seeing an opportunity in the market and actually taking advantage of that. Singapore does play a big part in the rest of the Asian market, I think, and there is movement about that. But I must say, China is such a huge powerhouse, and I think really, from the BVI perspective, it really is if you're going to be focusing on something, that's a focus in the region.
Thank you. So as all of you indicated before we began, we now have 2 days worth of material, so we can cancel our weekends and just talk. I want to start to drill down on some of these. Are all excellent topics you brought up. I'm going to start with Ellie, and let's start to think about, as Marianne was just saying, how does the BVI figure into our thinking as we answer and talk about these things? What does it mean for the BVI? So you talked about banking in China, and I'm a little. There's shadow banking. There are other banks emerging. There's still the big state banks, the big four. How can you break this down? Which are the banks that are emerging, and which are the banks that the BVI is dealing with or will be dealing with in the future?
We're seeing the BVI deal with all of the big state banks, a raft of shadow banks and mezzanine lenders as well. And we're seeing a lot of fund finance being done. I mean, the general trend we've seen is the banks we usually use have sort of moved away from things like leverage finance. You've got China Minsheng, for example, underwriting leverage debt for the first time, where our fee quotes are coming in, and Exim Bank are very active, CITIC are very active, CCB, these guys. So we're really seeing a very, very different constituency of banks coming to us on our BVI transactions, and they seem to they seem to be pretty comfortable with BVI companies already. That's one thing we found. We're not getting, we're not receiving unsophisticated queries on what we would consider to be sort of basic or boilerplate issues. The banks know what they're doing. They're familiar. Their in-house teams are already familiar with BVI entities. So I think it's good news and a good story for the BVI. We found the Singaporean banks to be much more helpful than Hong Kong banks. I'm sure everyone around the table has the same experience. And I've just spent 3 days in Singapore. We've had queries coming out, some of which have been funds queries. Actually, that's not my area. But people have still said that they need to structure their funds through BVI rather than Singapore. So it's an interesting one. On one hand, it's a competitor, but on the other hand, it's actually a little more BVI friendly than Hong Kong is in some respects.
But I think it depends on what sort of investors you're trying to attract, and if you're bringing in a lot of investors from different jurisdictions, then BVI is a good option. And I think the reason why the banks are so comfortable with the BVI is because of the registration system for security that's been in place since 2007 and has been tested. So that gives them, I don't know whether in reality it actually does mean that it's easier to enforce. It probably is. I mean, that would be your area. But I think it allows the banks to tick the boxes. And I think there's increasingly more of ticking the boxes.
Yeah. Yes. Claire, you brought up infrastructure before. And I want to shift into that One Belt, One Road. And how real is all of that, and what does the infrastructure play in Asia, and what role can the BVI play in that going forward?
Well, to answer the first question, I think it is very real. We've had a huge amount of involvement in several of the ongoing and historic. We were involved in the first initiative of the One Belt, One Road project. So yes, it's real. It's definitely a focus, I think, from an Asia financial services perspective. I read something a couple of weeks ago which suggested that there's trillions of dollars need to be invested, and indeed will be invested by not just the Chinese banks. I agree absolutely with Ellie's point. We're seeing absolutely a rise in Chinese banks being sort of the leaders and spearheading their involvement in that campaign, but indeed some of the international banks like HSBC came out in the press last week pledging their support to improve these things, because we're dealing with a massive region here which has, I think it's fair to say, a fairly underdeveloped or immature infrastructure setup. And if each of these regions want to keep pace with sort of global development and globalization, which I think is the primary focus and overall trend, there needs to be a huge investment in that space. And so, yes, I think it is very real, and it seems to me, certainly from our involvement in projects, that it is happening, and there are deals being done, and there are many more in the pipeline.
So the BVI has a role to play.
And the BVI, absolutely, and that's been our role predominantly throughout these transactions, is exactly that, is the use particularly, and again, sorry for going back to China, but a lot of the projects we've seen on that initiative have been driven from China, and they do appear to be very comfortable with the BVI structures, and so that is, from my perspective anyway, or experience, that is the jurisdiction that we're seeing used the most.
But I think other than China on the Belt and Road, there are very few, I guess, new frontiers in infrastructure, and particularly if you're looking at, I guess, the developed markets, and to the extent that the U.S., yes, we want to invest in infrastructure, but that could be sort of bogged down for quite a while, depending on, how political discussions progress. And so for a lot of these countries that are looking to, sort of expand, I think, further on their infrastructure, then we're going to see quite a lot of partnerships between China, the UK, China and the EU, China and the US, China and Australia, because they're all going to try to pile in to get a piece of the action. And so again, that goes to Marianne's point in that, when we're dealing with sort of offshore entities, and particularly BVI, which is very ubiquitous, I think, in Asia, and there's a high comfort level with that, then, it's a vehicle that can be utilized and to pool together a lot of the international investment in a way that permits comfort in that investment, and particularly the protections that, the legislation affords, but equally also permitting for exits. And so these are what sort of the international investors in the community is getting so excited about. And so, hopefully, I think BVI can,
So let's just stick with that for a minute. So is BVI fully engaged in this effort, or are there more things that BVI should be doing?
Certainly, I think there are more things that the BVI, can and could and should be doing. I think to a certain extent, a lot of the initiative and the policy was driven by the central government in Beijing, and they've earmarked trillions of dollars of funds attached to that. But in tandem with that, you've got private industry, private sectors in every number of different fronts that, I think the BVI could be aligning themselves in and engaging in dialogue, because, to the extent that, on a policy level, it's been set, and then to the extent that the SOEs and the banks are aligned with that. But, there are a lot of ancillary businesses that are all going to be, part and parcel of this journey. And so, and there are various associations that BVI could be, talking with. So to the extent that, yes, at the SOE level, they might know about it, but, are you actually getting to, the end user, the ones who are actually, getting involved in all of these? And I think that's more could be done there.
I would agree with that.
That's a good point, yes.
And often the end user is just a private individual, as we see so much in Hong Kong. I think that's where the new BVI micro company is going to really come into play. It's going to have a great appeal to private, wealthy, middle-class individuals in China.
Right.
And more than an association, but the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, the AIB. I saw when we were just looking up before this that Jersey has managed to make an application to be a member of that through the UK. So I wonder whether BVI, given it's as an overseas territory, might be able to do something else. I don't think Jersey itself is going to be putting in funding like other countries. But it's, you know, the
seat at a table.
yeah, absolutely, and it was very much, you know,
visibility,
cultural
right?
links, political links, economic links, and you know, it read very well. Looking at the application, so something else that BVI could consider, because you know, so many jurisdictions are going in that way. So yeah, definitely a seat at the table.
That's a really interesting point, because the BVI did, I mean, at the government level, as Frances says, they are involved. You know, there was the roadshow last year that was really well received, I must say. I was really surprised to show up at some of the seminars where, you know, we were expecting 200 and there were almost like 400 or 500 people. I mean, it was a huge room and there were people standing around. And they were mostly from the private sector. And there were some government events that were just aimed at government agencies. But I think, you know, engaging the associations and getting a seat on the table would be really, because people are already open to it.
Yes.
You know.
Yes, that's right. Our experience with the all the conferences and seminar in China is that not only for the kind of financial services side, but also for trust, private wealth, you know, succession planning, they are all very actually well educated about, you know, the BVI structures, all the vista structures that we can offer. So I think that's huge potential to continue to do that, because trust is an area of rapid growth in China.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to shift to a new topic. ASEAN. Is ASEAN coming together as an economic bloc, or is it still lagging? And if it is coming together, what are the current business opportunities?
I must admit, and I don't want to be the negative person at the table, but in our experience, I don't think so. Not at the moment. At least I sort of went around and spoke to some other people in the firm as well, just to see what other people think. And the general feedback on ASEAN was pretty much no. Everybody seems to at the moment be doing their own thing. So whether that will change, I'm not sure, but that's at least our experience in it.
Well, to the extent that the TPP is now sort of kind of dissolved, and then you had a number of initiatives before that with other ASEAN blocs, but it seems like they're in a bit of disarray and sort of still trying to figure out, well, what's the best way or what's the best organization to move forward to, you know, sort of get a lot more traction. And right now, the individual members of ASEAN have a lot of their own issues that they're trying to sort of get through as well. So it's sort of like, let's get our domestic house in order and before we... Yeah.
But
There's a lot of scope there.
But do countries like Indonesia present opportunities for BVI at the moment?
I think they did.
Yeah, a lot of legacy work out of Indonesia, but not much new work.
Yeah, I think they did, and I think there's a tendency to use Singapore, but I also think, you know, what you just said, there's internal issues that have to be sorted out, and it looked really promising a few years ago, but I must say I haven't seen them really working together on the
So
ASEAN sort of
is
front.
that true? I mean, Thailand, is there any opportunity there at the moment, or is that also?
I'd probably put Thailand into the same category as Indonesia in terms of there's lots of legacy work. And, you know, we're still servicing those jurisdictions, but we're not really seeing anything new.
So let's get positive. What markets show the most
China, definitely.
Okay. Three countries, China.
And I think on the Belt and Road, there's 65 countries, right? Yeah. So
Right.
there's a lot, you know, I think to be had and a lot, I think, to be done and a lot to sort of to focus on. You know, China is I guess, the catalyst. But equally, you know, I think if you start to focus on, you know, what are the big hit countries within Belt and Road, you can start focusing and developing those and creating a demand, I think, in those countries. And because, essentially, China is very, very large, and in a way, within that country, you don't know, and even the third tier, fourth tier cities are so huge. So it's kind of like, which one do I address? And it might be even easier if you go into some of these smaller countries and then get first mover, and then BVI goes in, then you start developing.
So you just follow Belt and Road west, right? From China right straight
haven't
through.
historically used BVI, so yeah, if you're looking for new territory, I guess there must be potential there.
Yeah, for the Belt and Road, as you mentioned, there's so many countries. Actually, what we find is that at the moment, what kind of countries stand out are those which has already got the government talking with the Chinese government. Like they kind of lead a political or kind of political plus business group and to have a visit in those countries. And then immediately after that, there's a huge contract signed for some railway and some huge infrastructure, canal work. So, you know, those are countries which will have which benefit a lot from the Belt and Road. And I don't know how long it would take for them to move around 65 countries. But I would say the political factor is quite a big one in terms of which country would actually stand out from, you know, out of the 65.
Very interesting. I want to switch to something else because I'm going to come back to a couple more things. But this is a general question, and Marianne, I'm going to give you this one. It's what forces are shaping asset protection, wealth succession, tax planning in Asia this year? What are the drivers?
I think the currency and, you know, I think the weakening RMB is important. Again, we go back to China, but I also think the currency control, you know, at a private level, it's a really big driving factor. At an international level, international corporate level, the forces behind it really are that I know there was a news report this morning that China was $33 trillion in debt at the moment. So there's, you know, a huge amount of debt that still hasn't been called in, and restructuring will have to happen. But there's still a lot of money to be invested out of China and a lot of money into China, and a lot of underdeveloped areas. You know, I worked in a fund that was able to raise $1 billion US dollars to sell toilet paper into Kenya. And they were hugely successful. So, you know, that's just an example of, you know, there's a lot of demand, and I think there's a growing sort of median wage in China and a growing middle class in China, and there's a lot of demand for international products, and I think that leads to a lot of opportunities. I was at a seminar just recently, and there was an Indian fund that was selling bathing suits into China. It's just, and you know, as simple as that. And they were using a Cayman structure, but they had a bunch of BVI companies in their in the holding group as well, and you know, they were hugely successful. So I think the major forces are really, obviously currency control is a really big one when you're talking about investing out, and there are certain areas that are just a no-go zone at the moment, like real estate, for example, because, you know, I think there's an overexposure to real estate, but venture capital is still an area that the Chinese government is interested in investing. So, and there are a few others like biotech as well, healthcare, infrastructure and things like that. So that's still, for the outbound work, that's still possible to get approval. There are banks that are set up in a free economic zone that can now lend directly overseas, which is new, I think, probably in the last 3 or so years. And that, you know, that is, it's a huge advantage for those banks that were allowed to operate in those zones, but they've been very successful with that. And I think just the sheer size of the Chinese market and the Chinese demand is really important for the inbound investment.
I don't know if you saw the SCMP this week. It was focused on the Vincent Lowe family, Great Eagle, and it was talking about the lack of planning and wealth succession. And I thought, wow, that's a great advertisement for the BVI, right?
I think I mean, BVI's, you know, what people want, I don't think it's changed in this year from previous years. You know, people want security, they want certainty, they want privacy, they want low cost, which BVI generally offers. Something from the sort of litigation perspective, I suppose, is the court system and making sure that is sorted out so that we can offer that sort of protection or sort of step in if there are problems, making sure that is actually, the message is that is absolutely sorted out is something from the litigation side that would help.
But I think certainly in Asia it's very different, I think, from, I guess, the North American and the European model. And that's really because I think Marianne is right in that there's a lot of demand for investment diversification, and then looking for value I think to the extent that sometimes, particularly, I guess, real estate is becoming more and more expensive in Asia, and then they are looking for the ability to diversify outbound. But other than that, I think in Asia, how it's different is because, you have generations. I mean, I think you have people within less than one generation that have generated such phenomenal wealth. So they're both not only looking at preservation, but they're still generating. So that makes things very complex, but it also makes things very, that there's a lot more demand. And because in one fell swoop, they want to be able to address all of these issues, plus they've got capital control issues. And that's not only in China, but you have security issues within, Southeast Asia that they have to contend with. So I think that really means that, I think those are, I guess, the forces that are shaping the asset protection and the wealth succession and the demand. And a lot of times it could be latent. They know it's there, but oftentimes you have to capture them at the right moment. Because otherwise, a lot of their attention is then diverted into wealth generation because they're still
In that
moving and shaking, as we speak. So, you need to be able to identify what those moments are, and it could be political issues that have happened, might be economic issues that have occurred, and identify, I guess, those moments and then be able to seize upon them. And it is very time sensitive because then otherwise their attention is then diverted.
Oh, that's very difficult. You really have to know the client, don't you?
Yeah. You don't want to tell them they should be thinking about retiring when they're in growth mode.
Yeah, one area that I find clients, particularly this year, private clients would focus on are the impact of CRS. Like they were asking, how is BVI compare with other jurisdictions? What are they doing on the CRS? Any clarifications? Any particular, innovative way to not necessarily avoid, but to comply with it. I think this is like quite a primary issue for them. It's in all the conferences that I've been to on private kind of wealth management, all talk about CRS, and the other one to go along with it, I suppose, is cyber attack. But that's more kind of like international rather than kind of BVI focus. But I guess the CRS point, BVI could do a lot more about that.
I led a seminar yesterday on two speakers talking about CRS and changing your citizenship. And the statement was made that within 10 years, CRS will be universal. And where I come from in America, no taxation without representation, but that goes by the boards. And I asked the lawyers, I said, is this legal? And they said, what do you mean? It's a fact of life. Who cares if it's legal?
Yeah, well, the US isn't a signatory to the CRS, and I think that's where I've seen, and for the first time ever, I have actually had Chinese clients, mainland Chinese clients, that wanted to go directly into a Delaware company and use that for their sort of personal structuring and completely bypass everything else. I mean, normally the Chinese wouldn't go into the US directly, but because there was no CRS requirements, and you don't fall under FATCA if you have a domestic company, so it was actually quite easy for them not to have to disclose anything to the Chinese authorities.
So in wealth succession and in CRS, do the clients normally think of BVI? Is that a solution that they turn to?
But there's no solution. There's 98 signatories to this, no matter where you go.
Is there any other opportunity?
US.
The US.
Delaware, Nevada.
Okay, all right. Well, that's a different jurisdiction.
Yeah, I mean, that's, the BVI can't, I can't see how a BVI can offer a solution to minimizing the impact of the CRS, because BVI hasn't asked for anything more than what, the CRS is asking for. And I think they've made, I know there were some hiccups with the filing for FATCA, but it's the same system, and I think that's been ironed out. Once the filing is made, I think the BVI has made it as easy as possible, because it's one filing with one authority, and then the BVI then has to take care of sending it to, almost 100 countries and dispersing the information. I don't think they could do anything less than that,
That's
unfortunately.
all we've been doing, explaining to the clients how the BVI works, but there's no kind of innovation that we can offer.
unfortunately.
Let me
Yeah.
draw it back then to asset protection and wealth succession, and I want to find out, is the role of family offices, is this growing, or is it constant, or is it changing at all?
I can offer some insight. Family office, again, focusing on China. For the past 2 years, has sprung around several hundreds. Family offices, often actually fairly small, like only one person, perhaps an ex-banker, came out and set up a family office initially, usually by invitation from a high net worth individual. But then the idea is that slowly they will grow their family office into more professional role, more institutional role. So we've seen several hundreds of family offices being set up in China, and they are all kind of focusing on the same group of clients. I mean, other than the ones who are set up to serve a particular family or particular high net worth individuals, but they were all competing, to get the work. And our experience is that I think they were growing too fast in a way, because they are not, a lot of them are not actually getting enough work, or they just keep on being a one-man band, and not a lot of work generated from what they are doing. So especially a lot of people still needs education in China on how to manage wealth management, succession planning. And it's still at a stage where, people are kind of warming up to the idea. They know it's a hot topic, but they still have difficulties finding the right professional to advise them. So in a way, BVI is coming in as quite a good opportunity, because we can offer them education on how to different types of trust structure, for instance, or even fund structure, or normal kind of investment. And they are not only looking at how to structure for family like wealth generation, they are also looking for investment opportunities both within Asia and also in Europe and in the US. So if we can offer them like one package, which can deal with all the different aspects, then I think BVI would come out very good, because as you've all mentioned, they are very familiar with BVI structures. So we are already at a stage where we can impress them. So I think there's a lot of potential in that area.
It's the next logical step in many ways. I think Fiona's right. In many respects, it just requires a little bit of marketing. And, part of that's going to be, frankly, taking the example of the hugely successful family offices we have here in Hong Kong. I mean, there are massive family offices here. Robert Miller, Kadori and Sons. And, they all use BVI structures. They're all constantly setting up new BVI private funds for investment purposes. They use the trust structures. I know we're all familiar with all of these large family offices, because they use the whole suite of offshore law firms. So that's the example. That's the success story. It's Hong Kong and the family office. If we can translate that to China, there's a great opportunity there for us.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Now I want to move on to, I think I was mentioning earlier, the disruption factors in the market. What is disrupting? What are the disruptors in 2017, and how do we deal with them? Anyone want to try that?
I think political climate is one of the single biggest disruptor, I think, now.
Can you be a little more specific?
I can be a lot more specific.
I like the guys.
The name.
Francis mentioned, the TPP has been
Right.
done away with. We have the world in a bit of a limbo at the moment. We have a hung parliament just recently in the UK. We have UK in the process of Brexit. We don't know what that would mean for EU or for the UK, and by implication for all of the trading parties with both EU and the UK. And China is a huge trading partner of both EU and the UK. The changes in the US, every day there seems to be something that's unexpected, and the next day there's something that was really unexpected. And so it's a really changing landscape, which I think makes it really difficult for, it's very difficult for new trade agreements to be struck, because we don't really know. There's very little constant at the moment. So I think that's a huge disruptor. And in terms of the deal flow, certainly the bigger deal flow, there's been a lot of, let's just let's just wait a little bit and see what's going to happen.
So things are on the
Because-
sidelines before the
Yeah.
sidelines.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money to be invested, but people
Yeah.
are very much waiting and seeing.
Yeah, there's great political uncertainty, which lends to business uncertainty.
Yeah.
But I guess, other than, I think for what it's worth, I do think that, technology is a huge disruptor.
So
And
tell me about that a little more. Tell me about technology being a disruptor.
I think technology, the advent of artificial intelligence, how that's going to be utilized just in everyday business. I think you've got, the most probably advanced country, I think, in that space, with social media and use of business online, et cetera, I think would be China. And that's because they've been able to leapfrog a lot of the infrastructure, the standard sort of protocol that have been put in place over hundreds of years, and in one fell swoop being able to leapfrog that. And because they've been able to do that, the way their advances are being developed is going to be very, very quick. But other than that, in terms of artificial intelligence, just the basic way that we would do things is going to absolutely change from, never mind sort of blue collar, type work, but even the way we would process, legal documents, or, how we would conduct a review, or if the computer is able to learn how to analyze, how to make decisions, then that's going to have huge implications in terms of how the pace at which business is being conducted, and how it's being conducted, and by whom it's being conducted. So I think that's coming within. It's already here. I think just case in point, I was just saying to my son the other day, when we were stuck in traffic, it was just like, oh, wouldn't it be great, if you didn't have to drive yourself, or you could teleport, etc. And yet I said, wait a minute, just a couple of months ago, I was in, sort of Silicon Valley, and then Google's have self-driving cars. So it's all there. So I think those are going to be huge sort of disruptors and big changes. And I think if you're not sort of au fait or ahead of the curve with that in terms of how your business is being aligned, then you're going to be left behind.
So when you talk about you, let's talk about the BVI then. What is the BVI response to that?
I think the BVI response to that, other than, we've got sort of the online registration, and, we're facilitating sort of all of that, is really looking at what kind of innovations, what kind of developments, what kind of legislation can we put in place to facilitate the trend that is already occurring. And because, BVI is reasonably nimble, the Parliament is small, they are in an absolute best case sort of situation in order to be, a first mover in that respect. And if you're waiting, as compared to the more developed countries, or even compared to Hong Kong and Singapore, who you say are competing, and they're on in sort of their mid-shore jurisdictions, and BVI is more nimble than they are. So can you put in, bells and whistles that can facilitate, that would permit and generate, and then put sort of BVI on the map to say, okay, we're renowned for this, and then this is where the market is moving.
What other disruptors are there? Talk about political, technological. Let me throw out one. Is there demographic? Is there millennials? And dealing with them as they come up, move up. I know we're dealing with wealthier, older people now, but do we have to pay attention to the people coming up the food chain and changing habits and taste and purchases? Do we have to deal with that at all?
I deal with millennials and venture capital a lot, actually, and it is a different way of doing things. It's not. I don't know how representative it is of things, but certainly there is no such thing as a weekend, and it's not in the same old sense where you're sort of being driven to do 12-hour days and on the matters, but they will they will Skype you. Sorry, they don't Skype you. They wanted to have my face time, and I was like, I won't do that. So you can Skype me. But WhatsApp things, we deal with WhatsApp messages, but they will actually do the video calls, and I'm like, yeah, I'm having breakfast on Sunday morning. I don't think that would be appropriate, but they don't really see a problem with that. So there is a difference, and these are quite small for now, but if the technology is the biggest disruptor, these are the people that are going to be bringing it in. So I think it will change the landscape.
Virtual reality is coming. It's not just a WhatsApp call, right?
But they're going to pop up on my
Yes,
table.
exactly. They're going to have breakfast with you in your PJs.
And these millennials like the BVI already because, we have an electronic communications app. We can do so much without originals. No one needs to sign things and certify them and put them in the post anymore. We can do it all on the basis of PDFs. And they love that because it's cheaper and it's faster.
Efficient.
Yeah.
Speaking of, so we were just talking about millennials, but let's go back to China. Isn't China going to be a disruptor in terms of its taste and what its people want becoming more and more of the norm in the world and sort of
They're influencing Hollywood as we speak.
exactly.
They're investing in
preference
it.
and habits.
So the culture is
I think it's
So the
already
movie
happening.
Lucy was done by the Chinese investors entirely, funded by the Chinese investors. You remember Lucy about the with Morgan Freeman and Scarlett Johansson with the disc. That was the
that was
Chinese.
right.
Which kind of once I knew that it explained the movie to me. But it is huge, and it's already even in terms of retail. There's huge influences because a lot of the leading designer houses actually try to cater to the Chinese market. They try to second guess what they think the Chinese market would want, rather than actually having relationships with the people on the ground. And I think that's one of the things that is a lesson for the offshore and for BVI, rather than trying to second guess what it is, keeping in touch and being part of the associations and hearing it firsthand, rather than trying to second guess what the market wants.
Because the face is so important in this part of the world, and the dialogue needs to be had.
Yes.
But this influence is it's massively prevalent already. I was in London a few weeks ago. There are Chinese-speaking sales assistants in Harrods now. 10 years ago they were putting Russian-speaking sales assistants in. Now it's Chinese. And look at the tourism industry and how that's changing and adapting.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting to see how it's actually the Chinese government are holding back this kind of international spread of influence of Chinese preference and habits, because like the capital control and the kind of unofficial ban on investing in entertainment, football clubs, and they are the one who are actually holding back. And probably they have other concerns like the renminbi and all the rest. But it's interesting to see, if it were not for the kind of capital control, the influence would actually spread a lot more internationally.
Regarding offshore and/or BVI, what keeps you up at night? What do you worry about?
I suppose going back to something that was talked about earlier, which is making sure that offshore stays relevant. So making sure, for example, we use them as JV companies, and so making sure that people are attracted to using them. When we've got sort of Singapore biting on our heels on the restructuring, for example, putting in all sort of new companies Act amendments to effectively put in a Chapter 11 type regime. They're very good at promotion. So Singapore is promoting that new regime a lot at the moment. And so it's making sure that we stay relevant, making sure that we continue to market BVI as a place to do business, and that it is a place that you want to do business.
Oh, interesting. Fiona.
Yeah, I agree. And for me, because I do quite a broad range of work, like corporate banking, insurance, private wealth trust. So for me, I suppose one thing that I would consider constantly is how I can take the opportunity, present on one of the aspect, and then link it to another aspect, and then kind of have BVI involved in developing that. Like there may be something that can sprung up in one of my finance deals that actually that present me some opportunity to connect with the underlying sponsors or underlying high net worth individuals to which I can sell the trust and the private clients aspect. So it's that connectivity that I'm trying to find, kind of place for BVI to fit in.
Right, Claire.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Joe mentioned. I mean, it's really, for me, is absolutely just making sure that we are in this part of the world. It remains really relevant, prominent, and important, and user friendly. I mean, it's it obviously prevails absolutely everything that all of us do and every area we practice in. And so as soon as there's any sort of perception issue or any, as you say, with the sort of anti-corruption, anything starts to infiltrate the jurisdiction, the impact on our businesses in particular would be dramatic.
Yes. Francis?
Probably a few things. I think specific, to BVI and offshore, that it doesn't allow it to be divided and conquered. And I think it's important, for offshore in general to sort of collaborate, to work together, to pitch above its weight, because I think a lot of the developed countries will try to divide and conquer. And so I think that aspect is going to, be very important in order to stay relevant, to stay in the forefront, and to continue to flourish. And I think the second and third for me is political and economic stability.
Well put. Yeah, Aislinn?
I guess as a common user of the courts there, that we continue to maintain a very strong court system there and that it's adequately staffed. It's obviously been inundated with more and more litigation, which is welcome for people like me and Joe across the table, but we're very proud of the jurisdiction and the standard of adjudication that has gone on there, and therefore that continue, and that we can be as proud of it as we have been. And we have an excellent commercial court, and we've had some great judges sitting. But we do again have competitors. Hong Kong is a competitor. You can always seize jurisdiction here. The courts can often hear BVI disputes, obviously Yung Key being sort of the one everyone's probably most familiar with. But and you have arbitration in jurisdictions here, Singapore and Hong Kong. So there are lots of solutions for our clients when it comes to disputes, and they can obviously go off piste and do their own thing as well, some form of mediation and whatnot. So we've got to keep BVI, and that's probably what keeps me up at night, or keeps me concerned that we can continue to compete on that front.
Thank you. Ellie?
I don't know. I feel very positive. I think BVI is still very relevant. It's a lovely view outside the window. Half of those buildings are owned by BVI companies. We still see BVI as the second largest source of foreign direct investment into China. And we've seen our incorporation numbers remain quite steady. What keeps me up at night is striking a balance, really. Because on one hand, our jurisdictions, and it's not just BVI, but BVI has suffered quite strongly from attack, from being labelled as places for money laundering and dirty business. And we have that on one side, and we're responding to that so well. But there's a balance to be struck between responding to that threat, standing up to it, responding to it and legislating to avoid corruption, but standing up to it and saying that's not what we stand for anyway. And yes, we will comply with CRS, we will ensure we remain OECD whitelisted, but at the same time, we're not going to make our jurisdictions so difficult to operate in that what makes them attractive to our current client base is going to push that client base away.
Well said. Thank you.
Well, it's a combination, actually. I think what Ellie said in the end is really my biggest concern, that we will legislate ourselves, regulate ourselves out of business unnecessarily. And I think I do actually quite agree with Francis's point that rather than competing with each other, there might be some room in the changing just in the changing global market for some of the offshore jurisdictions to actually not compete with each other and then weaken each other, but rather try to complement each other in the products that they offer.
Well, we have, believe it or not, gone over an hour. And I said an hour, so we're trying to keep it as close to that as possible. And I want to thank you all very much. This very stimulating conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure we'll continue. It'll be continued later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.